$6, Nathaniel Rhodes said, sliding the receipt across the table with 2 fingers, his voice smooth, almost amused. That's what attentiveness is worth tonight. The words didn't echo, but they landed. You could feel them settle into the room like dust no one wanted to acknowledge. Crystal glasses caught the amber light. A soft piano played somewhere behind velvet curtains. Conversations nearby thinned, then paused, as if the entire floor had quietly leaned in without turning their heads. Marissa Cole stood still for half a second, the weight of the tray balanced perfectly in her left hand, her posture straight, her expression composed. She had heard comments before, careless ones, cutting ones, the kind wrapped in politeness but sharpened by assumption. But this wasn't careless. This was deliberate. A test. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, custom suit flawless, silver at his temples catching the glow of the chandelier above. Around him sat investors, executives, people who measured life in margins and leverage. Some glanced at the receipt. Some avoided it. No one spoke. Because moments like this weren't about money. They were about hierarchy. About seeing who would shrink and who would stand. Marissa stepped forward just enough to take the check presenter, her movements calm, unhurried, as if nothing unusual had happened. But everything had. She was 27, working double shifts in a downtown Chicago restaurant where a single bottle of wine could cover her rent for a month. She knew the rhythm of rooms like this, the quiet arrogance, the subtle dismissals, the way people looked through her instead of at her. And she had learned something over time. Silence could protect you, but it could also define you. Nathaniel watched her closely now, not with anger, but with curiosity. This was the part he enjoyed. The reaction, the small surrender, a forced smile, a soft thank you, proof that the world still worked the way he believed it did. He had built an empire on that belief. Rhodes Meridian, a name that opened doors, closed deals, moved markets before sunrise. Control was his language. Precision was his comfort. And people were variables to be tested, measured, understood. Especially the ones no one else paid attention to. Marissa glanced down at the receipt for just a moment. $6. Not an accident. Not a miscalculation. A statement. She could feel the room waiting, holding its breath in that subtle, practiced way the wealthy had mastered, never obvious, always present. Somewhere, a glass was set down too carefully. A chair shifted an inch. The piano kept playing, but even that felt distant now. She placed the receipt back on the table with the same care she used to carry a full tray through a crowded floor. Her eyes lifted, steady, meeting Nathaniel's without challenge, without fear. And in that quiet exchange, something shifted, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to be noticed by anyone paying attention. Because this wasn't just a tip. And this wasn't just a response waiting to happen. This was a line drawn in a room built on invisible ones. And Nathaniel Rhodes, for the first time that night, wasn't entirely sure which side of it he stood on. No one laughed, but the silence felt heavier than laughter ever could. It stretched across the table, across the polished wood, across the perfectly arranged plates that no one touched anymore. Nathaniel Rhodes did not look away. He rarely did. He had built a life on holding eye contact just long enough to remind people who held the advantage. But something about Marissa Cole's stillness unsettled that rhythm. She did not rush. She did not apologize. She did not fill the space with nervous words. She simply stood there, as if time moved differently around her. One of the executives cleared his throat softly, adjusting his cufflinks, trying to reset the atmosphere back to business, back to numbers, back to something measurable. Nathaniel, he said lightly, forcing a smile, we should probably revisit the projections before dessert. But Nathaniel lifted a single hand, not even looking at him, and the man stopped mid-sentence. Control returned to the table, but not completely. Not the way it usually did. Nathaniel's gaze flicked briefly to the receipt again, then back to Marissa, as if he were recalculating something he could not quite name. Across the room, a server paused near the bar, pretending to polish a glass while watching through the reflection. Another guest leaned slightly in his chair, just enough to hear without being seen. These were the moments that never made it into reports or headlines, but everyone remembered them. The quiet ones. The ones where power shifted without permission. Marissa felt all of it. The weight of attention. The expectation pressing in from every direction. She had stood in rooms like this before, invisible until she was suddenly not. She had learned how quickly respect could disappear and how rarely it returned. But she had also learned something else. That dignity was not something handed to you across a table. It was something you carried in with you, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. She placed the check presenter gently beside Nathaniel's hand, not pushing it toward him, not pulling it away, just leaving it there, like a mirror he could choose to look into or ignore. Her voice, when it came, was calm, even, almost quiet enough to miss if you were not paying attention. "Sir," she said, "service is not measured by what is left behind at the end of a meal." She paused, not for effect, but because she did not need more words than necessary. It is measured by how it was given. The sentence did not rise. It did not challenge. It simply existed, steady and complete. And that was what made it land. Nathaniel did not respond immediately. For the first time that evening, he blinked a little slower, as if something in that statement had interrupted a pattern he had followed for years. He leaned back slightly, the leather chair soft beneath him, but the comfort felt distant now. Around him, the room remained still, suspended in that fragile space between what had been said and what it meant. Because everyone understood something had just happened. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. And Nathaniel Rhodes, a man who had spent decades deciding outcomes before anyone else had finished speaking, found himself doing something unfamiliar. He was thinking about an answer before he gave it. The air did not recover after her words. It shifted, subtly, but unmistakably, like a room where the temperature drops a few degrees and no one can explain why. Nathaniel Rhodes tapped his index finger once against the edge of the table, a habit he had developed over years of negotiations when he needed to buy himself a second without showing hesitation. But this was not a negotiation. There were no contracts here, no numbers to anchor him, no leverage to pull. Just a sentence that had refused to bend in front of him. He glanced briefly at the men seated around him, expecting someone to restore the balance with a joke, a comment, anything to dissolve the tension. But no one moved, because they were watching him now, not as the man in control, but as the man being measured. And that was new. Marissa did not wait for permission to leave. She inclined her head slightly, not submissive, not defiant, simply acknowledging the end of an interaction that, to her, required no further explanation. Then she turned, her steps quiet against the polished floor, the tray still steady in her hand. She did not look back. She never did. Behind her, the room slowly began to breathe again, but it was different now. Conversations resumed, but softer, more cautious, as if everyone had just witnessed something they were not supposed to see. Nathaniel leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table, his gaze following her retreating figure for a moment longer than necessary. There was something about the way she carried herself. Not confidence in the loud sense he was used to, not the kind that filled rooms and demanded attention, but something quieter, more stable, the kind that did not need approval to exist. It irritated him, and yet it held his attention. "Interesting," he said finally, his voice low, almost to himself. One of the executives chuckled nervously, eager to align. "Just a server with a line, Nathaniel. Happens." But Nathaniel did not smile, because it did not feel like something that just happened. It felt intentional, even if she had not raised her voice, even if she had not challenged him directly. It felt like she had seen through the test and refused to play the role he had assigned. And that was not something he encountered often. He reached for his water glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down with precision. Control was not something he lost. It was something he recalibrated. Always. "What is her name?" he asked, not looking up. The question landed heavier than expected. The man to his right hesitated, then signaled discreetly toward a manager standing near the entrance. Within seconds, the manager approached, posture tight, smile professional. "Yes, sir." Nathaniel did not waste words. "The server. The one who just handled this table." The manager glanced quickly in the direction Marissa had gone, then back at Nathaniel. "That is Marissa Cole, sir." Nathaniel repeated the name once in his mind, as if committing it to memory for reasons he had not fully decided. Yet, Marissa Cole. Names mattered. They always had. They were the first step in turning someone from background into variable. But as he sat there, staring at the untouched dessert menu, something unfamiliar settled in beneath the surface of his thoughts. Not anger. Not even irritation anymore. Something closer to curiosity, edged with something he would not have admitted out loud. Because for the first time in a long time, the outcome of a moment had not been determined by him. And that, more than the words themselves, was what stayed with him. The dinner did not last much longer after that, even though no one said it out loud. Courses arrived on time, plates were cleared with quiet efficiency, wine was poured with practiced precision, but the rhythm had changed in a way that could not be undone. Nathaniel Rhodes continued the meeting, discussing numbers, projections, expansion strategies, all the language that had made him powerful, but his words carried a fraction less weight, not to the room, but to himself. Because somewhere between the entree and dessert, something had interrupted the certainty he relied on. When the meeting finally ended, chairs slid back softly, jackets were adjusted, and polite handshakes replaced the tension that had lingered beneath the surface. "We will follow up in the morning," Nathaniel said, his tone controlled, his posture unchanged. The men around him nodded quickly, grateful to return to familiar ground. Deals made sense. Numbers made sense. This did not. He stepped away from the table, straightening his cuff as he moved toward the private hallway that led to the exit. The restaurant lights dimmed slightly in that corridor, warmer, quieter, designed for discretion. Conversations from the main floor faded into a distant hum. For a moment, it was just him and the sound of his own footsteps against polished marble. He should have left. That was what he always did. Close the meeting. Secure the outcome. Move on. But instead, he slowed. Not because he was uncertain of where he was going, but because his mind had not moved on with the rest of him. Marissa Cole. The name returned without invitation. Not as a detail, but as a presence. He had encountered confidence before. He had dismissed it, rewarded it, crushed it, depending on what served him best. But what he had seen at that table was not confidence shaped by ambition. It was something else. Something that did not ask to be acknowledged. And that made it harder to ignore. As he reached the end of the hallway, he noticed a small waiting area near the side entrance, partially shielded from the main dining room by a decorative partition. It was easy to overlook, designed for privacy rather than attention. And that was where he saw her again. Marissa stood beside an older woman seated in a wheelchair, her uniform still crisp despite the long shift, her posture unchanged. The woman's hands rested lightly on her lap, a silk scarf draped neatly over her shoulders. She looked tired, but not uncomfortable. Marissa was speaking to her softly, her voice low, steady, the kind that did not rush or demand, but stayed present. Nathaniel paused, just out of view, not out of intention, but out of instinct. He was not used to observing without being seen. The woman dropped her glove, a small, simple motion that could have easily gone unnoticed in a place like this. But Marissa noticed. She bent slightly, picked it up, and placed it back into the woman's hand with care, as if the action itself mattered. No performance, no audience, just attention. The woman smiled, a quiet, genuine expression, and said something Nathaniel could not fully hear. Marissa nodded, responding with the same calm tone, as if this moment carried the same importance as any table in the dining room. And that was what held him there. Not the action itself, but the consistency of it. There was no shift in her behavior when no one important was watching. No adjustment for status. No calculation. Just the same steady presence he had seen at the table, now without the pressure of scrutiny. Nathaniel felt something unfamiliar press against the edges of his thoughts. Not discomfort. Not exactly. Something closer to recognition, though he could not immediately place of what. Because in all his years of building, of acquiring, of controlling outcomes, he had learned how people performed when they were being observed. But this was not performance. This was something quieter, and somehow, more difficult to define. He stood there a moment longer than he intended, then adjusted his jacket slightly, as if resetting himself, and stepped forward into view. This time, the room did not feel like it belonged to him. Marissa noticed him the moment he stepped into view, not because he made a sound, but because people like Nathaniel Rhodes carried a presence that shifted the air around them. Still, she did not straighten or adjust or suddenly change her tone. She remained exactly as she was, one hand resting lightly on the back of the wheelchair, the other holding the folded glove she had just returned. The older woman followed her gaze and turned slightly, her expression softening into recognition. Nathaniel paused for a fraction of a second, caught between the version of himself that commanded rooms and the one that had just been quietly observed from the outside. "Good evening," Marissa said, her voice even, neither warm nor cold, simply present. No trace of the earlier moment at the table lingered in her tone. No edge, no reminder, just acknowledgement. Nathaniel inclined his head slightly, a gesture so small most would have missed it, but for him, it was something. I did not realize you were still on shift, he replied, his voice measured, as if choosing each word more carefully than usual. Marissa gave a small nod. Almost finished, she said. The older woman beside her adjusted the scarf on her shoulders, then looked up at Nathaniel with a faint, knowing smile. You must be very important, she said gently, her voice carrying the kind of calm that did not need confirmation. Nathaniel hesitated, just briefly. He had been called many things in rooms filled with influence and ambition, but rarely in a tone like that. Something like that, he answered, though the words felt less certain than they usually did. Marissa did not react to the exchange. Instead, she reached down and adjusted the footrest of the wheelchair slightly, making sure it was aligned comfortably, her movements precise and unhurried. It was a small action, almost invisible, but it carried the same quiet intention as everything else she had done that evening. Nathaniel watched her, not openly, but enough to notice the absence of performance. There was no audience here that mattered to her. No gain. No advantage. Just the act itself. You handled the table earlier, he said after a moment, the statement landing somewhere between observation and unfinished thought. Marissa met his gaze again, steady as before. I did, she replied. No apology followed. No explanation. The silence that came after was not awkward. It was deliberate, like a space left open for something that had not yet been said. Nathaniel shifted his weight slightly, his hand brushing against the edge of his jacket, as if grounding himself in something familiar. He was used to conversations that moved toward outcomes, toward agreements, toward control. This did not move that way. This held. The older woman looked between them, her eyes thoughtful, as if she understood more than either of them had spoken aloud. It is rare, she said softly, to see someone who does not change depending on who is watching. Her words were not directed at anyone specifically, but they settled in the space between Nathaniel and Marissa with quiet clarity. Marissa offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, not in response to praise, but in acknowledgement of truth. Nathaniel felt the weight of that sentence more than he expected, because he had spent a lifetime adjusting, calculating, refining himself based on who was across the table. It had made him successful. It had made him powerful. But standing there, in a quiet corner of a restaurant, it suddenly felt like something else too. Something incomplete. He looked at Marissa again, this time not as a variable, not as a test, but as something he had not yet defined. And for the first time that evening, he spoke without strategy. You meant what you said, he said. It was not a question. Marissa did not hesitate. Yes, she answered. Just that. No elaboration. No defense. The simplicity of it left no room for interpretation. And in that moment, Nathaniel Rhodes understood something he had not planned to learn that night. Some answers do not challenge power. They reveal it. The words did not fade after she said them. They stayed, suspended in the quiet space between them, as if the room itself had decided not to move forward just yet. Nathaniel Rhodes exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but because something in him had shifted in a way he could not immediately control. He had spent decades mastering control over rooms, over deals, over people. But this was different. This was not something that could be negotiated or redirected. It simply existed. The older woman beside Marissa adjusted her hands slightly in her lap, her gaze soft but observant, as if she had seen this kind of moment before in ways neither of them fully understood. Nathaniel glanced at her, then back at Marissa, his expression no longer guarded in the same way. Most people, he began, his voice quieter now, less performative, say what they think they are supposed to say. He paused briefly, as if weighing the rest of the sentence before letting it go. You did not. Marissa held his gaze without tension, without urgency, as if time did not press on her the way it did on everyone else in the building. Most people, she replied calmly, are used to being measured before they are understood. Her tone did not accuse. It did not defend. It simply stated something that felt already proven. Nathaniel let out a faint breath through his nose, something close to a quiet acknowledgement, though he did not label it that way. He shifted slightly, his hand brushing against the edge of the wheelchair, steadying it without thinking as the older woman adjusted her position. The gesture was small, almost unconscious, but it did not go unnoticed. Not by Marissa, not by the woman beside her, and not by him. Once he realized he had done it, he withdrew his hand slowly, as if reconsidering something he had not planned to reconsider. "What makes you certain," he asked after a moment, his voice more curious now than authoritative, "that you are not being measured right now?" The question might have sounded like a challenge in another context, but here it landed differently. Softer. Searching. Marissa did not answer immediately. She glanced briefly toward the main dining room, where the muted rhythm of the restaurant continued, then back at Nathaniel. "Because," she said, "you already decided what I was worth before you asked." The statement settled into the space with quiet precision. No edge, no emphasis, just truth placed exactly where it belonged. Nathaniel did not respond right away. He looked at her, really looked this time, not through the lens of status or role, but as if trying to understand something that had been outside his framework for a long time. The older woman shifted again, her voice breaking the stillness gently. "It is not easy," she said, "to be seen without the things that usually define you." Nathaniel glanced at her, his brow tightening slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition, because he knew exactly what she meant, even if he had never put it into words. His name, his company, his wealth, they had always entered rooms before he did. They had shaped every interaction, every outcome. But here, in this quiet corner, none of that seemed to hold the same weight. Marissa stood there, unchanged by it. And that, more than anything else, unsettled him. He straightened slightly, adjusting his posture out of habit, but the movement felt less certain than usual. "Marissa Cole," he said, her name deliberate now, no longer just a detail, but something he intended to remember. "You are aware that most people in your position would have handled that situation differently." Marissa gave a small nod, acknowledging the obvious without diminishing it. "Yes," she said simply. Nathaniel studied her for a moment longer, then asked the question that had been forming beneath everything else. "And what do you think that cost you?" It was the kind of question he had built his life on. Cost. Value. Trade. But this time, it did not land the same way. Marissa did not hesitate. "Nothing," she said. Then, after a brief pause, she added, "It only costs something if you were planning to trade it." The sentence did not rise. It did not push. But it landed deeper than anything else that had been said that night. And for the first time in a long time, Nathaniel Rhodes had no immediate answer. The silence that followed her answer did not feel empty. It felt full, as if something unseen had just been placed on the table between them and neither of them was willing to move it first. Nathaniel Rhodes lowered his gaze for a brief moment, not in defeat, but in something far less familiar to him. Reflection. The word cost had always come with numbers in his world, with contracts, with outcomes that could be calculated and justified. But what she had just said did not fit into any system he had built. It did not offer return. It did not require exchange. It simply stood on its own. He looked back up at her, slower this time, as if the pace of his thoughts had changed without his permission. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm, but it no longer reached him the same way. The clink of glass, the soft footsteps, the distant conversations, all of it felt like background noise to something more immediate, more present. The older woman beside Marissa shifted slightly, her eyes moving between them with a calm understanding that did not need to be explained. She had seen this before. Not this exact moment, not these exact people, but the shift itself. The moment when someone who had always defined value in one way began to question whether that definition had ever been complete. Nathaniel straightened, not out of habit this time, but as if he were adjusting to a new weight he had just become aware of. "Then what is it worth?" he asked, his voice quieter than it had been all evening, not directed at the room, not even entirely at her, but somewhere in between. Marissa did not rush to answer. She looked at him, steady as before, then glanced briefly at the older woman, as if grounding the moment in something real before responding. "That depends," she said, "on whether you are trying to own it or understand it." The words settled differently than the others. They did not challenge him. They redirected him. Nathaniel let out a slow breath, his hand moving slightly as if to gesture, then stopping midway, the motion unfinished. He was not used to unfinished things. Not in business. Not in conversation. But here, He found himself leaving space instead of filling it. The older woman smiled faintly, her voice soft but clear. Some things, she said, lose their meaning the moment you try to put a price on them. Nathaniel glanced at her again, his expression tightening just slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition. Because he had done exactly that. Not just tonight. Not just with $6. But over years. Over decisions. Over people. The realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded, piece by piece, each one quieter than the last, but heavier. He looked back at Marissa, his eyes searching now, not for weakness, not for advantage, but for something he had not considered before. Consistency. Integrity. Something that did not shift based on who was watching. You are not trying to prove anything, he said, more to himself than to her. Marissa shook her head slightly. No, she replied. I am just not trying to lose anything. The sentence lingered, simple on the surface, but deeper the longer it sat. Nathaniel absorbed it without responding, his thoughts moving in directions he had not planned. For the first time, that night, the question was no longer about her. It was about him, about what he had gained, about what he might have lost without noticing. The hallway felt quieter now, not because the sounds had disappeared, but because his focus had shifted entirely. He adjusted his jacket once more, but the gesture no longer carried the same certainty it once did. It felt like habit trying to keep up with change. He looked at her one more time, not as a test, not as a variable, but as a moment he could not dismiss. And in that stillness, something settled. Not a conclusion. Not yet. But the beginning of one. The moment did not end with a final word. It dissolved slowly, like something understood rather than concluded. Nathaniel Rhodes gave a small nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement of something he could not yet fully articulate. Then, without another attempt to control the conversation, he stepped back. It was a subtle shift, but it mattered, because men like him did not step back. They advanced, redirected, or closed. They did not leave space. But this time he did. Marissa did not follow him with her eyes as he turned. She returned her attention to the older woman beside her, adjusting the edge of the scarf once more, her movements as steady as they had been all evening. The interaction was over for her. It had already given what it needed to give. Nathaniel walked down the hallway toward the exit, his steps measured, but no longer carrying the same invisible certainty that had defined him earlier that night. The city air outside met him with a quiet chill, the kind that made you aware of your surroundings again after being inside too long. Chicago at night moved in its usual rhythm, headlights passing, distant horns, the low hum of a city that never truly paused. His driver stepped forward, opening the door of the car, but Nathaniel did not get in immediately. He stood there for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, his mind replaying something that refused to stay in the past where it belonged. $6. A sentence. A glance that did not yield. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. But it had stayed. That was the part he could not ignore. He finally stepped into the car, the leather interior familiar. Controlled, predictable. The door closed with a soft, precise sound. Home, sir, the driver asked. Nathaniel did not answer right away. He looked out the window as the city lights moved past in reflections, each one brief, each one gone before it could settle. Yes, he said finally, though the word felt automatic, detached from the rest of his thoughts. The ride was quiet. It always was. But tonight, the silence did not feel like efficiency. It felt like space. And in that space, something began to surface that he had not allowed himself to examine in years. Not in meetings. Not in decisions. Not in the carefully structured life he had built. Moments. Small ones. Ones that did not show up on balance sheets. Ones that did not carry immediate consequence. He thought about the way Marissa had spoken, not to impress, not to resist, but to remain intact. He thought about the older woman's words, about meaning slipping away the moment it was assigned a price. He had heard similar ideas before, in passing, in speeches, in conversations he had dismissed as philosophical rather than practical. But this had not felt abstract. It had felt specific, personal. As the car moved through the city, Nathaniel leaned back slightly, his hand resting against the armrest, fingers still. He was used to evaluating risk, to projecting outcomes, to deciding what mattered based on measurable return. But tonight had offered something without a clear return. No advantage. No leverage. Just a shift he had not planned for. When the car pulled up to his building, the driver stepped out quickly, opening the door again. Nathaniel exited without speaking, his movements precise out of habit, but his thoughts still somewhere else entirely. The lobby lights reflected off polished marble, quiet, controlled, just like everything else in his world. He walked through it without stopping, without acknowledging the staff who greeted him, not out of disregard, but because he was not fully present. Not here. Not yet. As the elevator doors closed and the city disappeared from view, one thought settled more clearly than the rest. Not as a conclusion, but as a question he could not dismiss. For all the things he had built, all the things he could measure, all the things he could control, what had he never thought to value until someone refused to let him define it for them? The elevator doors closed with a soft precision, sealing Nathaniel Rhodes inside a space that reflected him from every angle, polished steel, controlled lighting, nothing out of place, nothing unmeasured. He stood still as the numbers climbed, one floor at a time, but his thoughts did not follow the same order. They moved backward, not through deals or victories or headlines, but through something far less documented. Moments he had overlooked, conversations he had ended too quickly, people he had assessed before they had finished speaking. By the time the doors opened again, he had already stepped into a version of himself he did not fully recognize. His penthouse greeted him with silence, the kind that came from design, not absence. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the skyline, the city glowing below like something distant, almost decorative. Everything was exactly where it should be. Every line clean. Every surface perfect. And yet, for the first time in a long time, it felt incomplete. Nathaniel walked in slowly, removing his jacket, placing it over the back of a chair with the same precision he applied to everything in his life. He loosened his cufflinks, setting them down beside a stack of documents waiting on the glass table. Reports. Agreements. Numbers that would shape decisions in the morning. He did not touch them. Instead, he moved past them, toward the far end of the room where a single desk sat under a muted light. He opened a drawer without hesitation, retrieving a folder he had not looked at in months. His will. Structured. Detailed. Final. It had been written with the same logic he applied to everything else. Distribution based on value. Contribution. Alignment. It made sense. It always had. Until tonight. He sat down, the chair soft beneath him, the city stretching out behind the glass, and opened the document. The pages did not change. The words did not shift. But something in the way he read them did. He saw numbers where he had once seen security. Conditions where he had once seen fairness. Control where he had once believed there was clarity. And beneath all of it, something else. Absence. Not of wealth. Not of structure. But of something he had never thought to include. He leaned back slightly, one hand resting against the edge of the desk, the other holding the page still. Marissa Cole's voice did not echo, but it remained. Not as sound, but as meaning. Something that had not asked to be measured. Something that had not been offered for exchange. Something that had simply refused to be reduced. Nathaniel closed the folder slowly, not as a final decision, but as the end of an old one. He sat there for a long moment, the room quiet around him, the city continuing without him just beyond the glass. Then, without urgency, without hesitation, he reached for his phone. His fingers paused briefly above the screen, not because he did not know what to do, but because he understood, for the first time, that this was not a move. Not a strategy. Not a correction. It was a choice. A different kind of one. He made the call. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but no longer shaped by control. I need to revise the document, he said. No explanation followed. None was needed. He ended the call, setting the phone down gently, his hand lingering for a second before pulling away. The room remained the same. The city remained the same. Nothing visible had changed. But something had. Not in the numbers. Not yet. But in the space between them. Nathaniel Rhodes stood up, walking toward the window, his reflection meeting him in the glass, no longer framed by certainty alone. And somewhere across the city, in a quiet apartment that did not appear on any list he tracked, Marissa Cole was finishing her night the same way she always did. Without knowing. Without needing to know. Because what she had given that evening was not meant to be returned. It was not meant to be counted. It was not meant to be owned. It was simply left behind, like something that could not be taken, only recognized. And for a man who had spent his life believing everything had a value, the most expensive lesson he learned that night was this. Some things do not change when you pay for them. They change when you finally understand them.